episode of Media Watch. Been away for a couple of weeks, but we're back, and we're back nice and strong with some great guests like we try and get every week. We have had quite a lot of media to look at. I don't think I've ever watched that much CNN in my whole life. And obviously that's down to the fact that we had the US elections. So my guests today are Dr. Preet. Welcome to the show. I've also got Gia, and Gia is studying economics and authority. I think she takes a lot of interest in the whole of this Trump situation. And we also have Gurpreet Singh. He's the General Secretary of the Sikh Council. He's also President of the Khalsa Jatha British Isles, one of the oldest, it is the oldest Gurdwara in the UK, the oldest Gurdwara Sahib in the UK. The subject today is really to talk about, have we really seen the back of Trump? I mean, I've got 3 things to go through. Were you surprised about how neck and neck it was? Why did it look like 50% of the population voted for one candidate versus the other candidate? And then the other one's more about manners. You know, it's all about manners. My personal view is that, you know, being a leader is not about being rash or about being ruthless or being a disruptor for the sake of being a disruptor. It needs to be clear and inclusive. And I'm certainly impressed with Biden's very kind of warm, open arm, we are the people, we are the United States. And that's a lovely sentiment to hear. And I actually agree with it. I really do. Okay, so let's start off with Dr. Preet. Dr. Preet, what's your view on this situation about, you know, how neck and neck it was? Were you surprised?
I wasn't at all surprised. You see, the people in the mainstream media, they had there was a concept there of the silent Trump voter, just like you got the silent Brexiteer. If all of the media is complaining about an individual and he's painted in a bad light, people wouldn't necessarily want to admit that they're Trump supporters. When they go to the ballot box and they're putting in their vote, that's when they're making it happen. I've got some inside information from people in the US on the West Coast and the East Coast, and actually even from Texas. And one of the things they said, you will be surprised when you hear all of Trump's rhetoric about migrants and blocking off the country and all this kind of stuff. Weirdly, it's some of the minorities that have been actually supporting Trump, not just the white, traditional, Christians in the middle of the country that we expect. The Bible Belt followers or the Confederate followers. Is actually surprisingly, he's had a lot of Latino people. And I've been told, although I don't have any relatives in this position, I've been told that many Indians and Chinese have voted for Trump. And those are due to some of his fiscal policies, which favor business. And they've been very, very worried about the Democrats. So when it comes to push to shove, it's about your pocket. And a lot of people have been thinking, oh, we'll rather have this Trump fellow, even though he's a nasty guy.
They voted with looking at the dollar in their pocket. Maybe that was the situation. And I think it's interesting what you're saying about the minorities voting for him. The candidate, the Biden candidate, was positioned as being more of a socialist on the left. And there was a suggestion that those that were living in Florida from a Venezuelan background had kind of nightmares, inverted commas, from the previous regime, and the kind of synonymizing the whole situation with communism is related to socialism. But I'm not sure whether they're confused or whether at the end of the day they've come from a country where they've suffered quite heavily, and it's not down to socialism at the end of the day. Let me bring in Gia here. Gia, good to have you on the show. You're a very prudent observer of this whole situation. Neck and neck, do you think it was? Were you surprised?
I mean, when you look at the polls, which did see Biden winning, very obviously, it was a surprise. But if you look at de facto what was going on in America, the sentiment, the zeitgeist, all of these things, you would argue that perhaps America was divided, and you did see this massive divide between people who want the new, people who wanted kind of a fairer America for everyone, with those who are kind of protecting the old ways. And I guess we see that most prominently in the idea of guns and how divisive that, just as an example, is of protecting your constitution. And even that has been exacerbated by COVID, when we see this idea of freedom and not wanting to wear masks kind of countered with the idea of staying safe, particularly, like in Michigan, the mayor or the head of the state was very much pro a lockdown and pro COVID restrictions, and yet you have this massive Republican sector that wants to stop all of that because it's stopping civil liberties, traditional civil liberties. So I guess that's where the divide comes in. It's very much ideological, I do believe.
I do think it's really interesting that you bring up the COVID situation, because obviously to a certain extent there's like what's your track record, you could argue, on helping to solve the problem. I mean, he had sourced PPE stuff, he had spent a lot of time also not necessarily being very clear. The clarity just wasn't there, interrupting press conferences to put his own kind of spin on things. And then, you could see the camp positioning themselves to say, well, look, the increasing death toll is not being addressed. We don't live in the US, so we don't know what we get to hear day in, day out, and we don't know what the local governors are actually trying to do. But as head of state, maybe the dynamic is different in the UK. Tell us, Gurpreet, when you look at Boris Johnson, doing his daily stand-up, it's an IT term, isn't it? And they do the daily stand-up and they talk about their current situation, the status, how people really need to be more careful. Like I said before, we don't live in the US, so we don't know what happens out there, whether they've got local communication going on. But were you surprised that, this massive polarization seemed to be evident in the polls?
No, I actually wasn't surprised. You got to remember, Trump is a populist leader. That means he has popularity. There are people who are going out there to support him. He got elected with a sizable support in 2016. So it's not going to be easy to knock down an incumbent. The Democratic Party first needs to go through the struggle of choosing who their leader is going to be to do that job. And there's differences within the Democrats on that. The choice of Kamala Harris also as VP was an interesting one. So it's not easy. The Democrats were fighting an uphill battle, and that's shown in the results. It was so neck and neck.
But the polls didn't say that, did they? The polls said that he had a 8-point lead at one point. This is Biden.
We'll never rely on polls. Polls are going to literally be getting a bit, someone's view, whether they give it truthfully or not. We've been in that situation here where we've seen conservative governments get elected when the polls were all saying it's Labour. So people, especially Republicans or Conservatives, don't always express their feelings to the pollsters.
Okay, so you think they're a little bit more reserved, and there may be someone who give you a surprise on the day?
More reserved and probably not wanting to get into the argument. Just like Dr. Jatha said, if someone was a Brexiteer and they went out and openly said it, you'd just end up dealing with lots and lots of arguments that, oh my God, why are you doing that? We saw how polarized that became in the UK, where it's, people were hating on each other depending on which side of the debate they were on, but it was actual hate, not a proper discussion on policies and actualities, but more of a hate campaign going on.
So when it comes to the economy, right? I mean, and it was interesting. People may have different viewpoints based on looking at the pound or the dollar in their pocket. That doesn't necessarily lean towards more of a world community or people working together. I mean, would you pull out of the Paris Accord for climate change because your opinion is that it's not making a difference, or is it because you just don't believe in the science? And that's so you see straight away the task force that Biden's putting together. That's the first executive order he's going to sign. Apparently, is go back into the Paris Agreement. I mean, that's a fundamental different perspective. One about science and maybe one about protectionism. Because if you've got an open ticket, to be able to pollute, then in theory you would have an uneconomic product, you know.
It's interesting because sometimes it might be the easy result to say, well, look, if we're allowed to pollute, we just continue as normal. But being challenged by the science and looking at what you can do to reduce your footprint has led to innovation, and that innovation is coming from the US. We've seen in solar technology, wind technology, electric cars, Tesla. You know, there's a lot of innovation coming out of the US. It's not to say that if you clamp down on pollution, that you're going to kill your business. No, your businesses are going to move in a different direction. Economies and people adapt. We all need to travel. We all need to move around. We all need to be doing things. We just adapt and start to learn to do that in a better way for the environment. And that's how things will happen in the US and wherever else we are, which in any country that seriously appreciates the impact of global warming.
Absolutely. Gia, let's bring you back here for a second. Give us your economic perspective on, obviously you've got climate change, you've got the impact, you've got protectionism. Trump was very much a person to talk about make America great again. This kind of like, we don't want to deal with China. We don't want to deal with these other countries. We want to focus in on our particular products and our particular jobs, whatever our means. It kind of deters the fact that we're not one world anymore, or maybe we never were,
Yes, I do think people have become insular, and I'm going to go back to COVID to explain that. And I think COVID has in some ways brought us together, but has made us more insular. And I think this idea of coming out of the Paris Agreement for America, I think it's driven a lot by these economic motives and this idea of, as you were alluding to before, the ability to pollute without kind of having to pay the price.
It's like a one world thing, isn't it? We've got protectionism. Yeah. We've got, if I don't have to kind of conform, I can have more mines. I don't have to look at alternative methods. I can, get jobs back to the miners, whatever that means. So. Isn't that a contradiction, or is that another economic model? On one side, you got Gurpreet saying, well, it leads to more opportunities, more innovation, more products. But the issue that we have is, from an economic perspective, the quick fix is to go back to bad habits.
And I do think that we're heading that way. And I personally think that was one of the key motives for Trump to get out of the Paris Agreement. Trump is obviously very driven by economics. I think behind his ideology that pushes him, and that pushes a lot of his voters. And I think his voters were very in favor of this idea of America still being that great exporter, getting that revenue. And I do think that pushed a lot of his decisions. But the fact that Biden has kind of changed that, I wonder what that will mean for the economic implications. I mean, we might look to Gurpreet's argument and say, actually, well, could that bring new innovation, and could that bring a new era for America? For example, many of the great innovators in history, Thomas Edison, they do come from America. So it's interesting to see where their future will go.
There are people in these old industries who haven't moved on. They need to get these people employed, but can I get the votes from these people? Yes, I can. How do I say it? I say, well, China's polluting. The fact that China's polluting on the US's behalf by making goods and services there, and actually all you're doing is taking the American pollution there. I mean, you look at per capita usage of electricity in the US, it's huge. Right? It's like double or triple, which always makes me laugh how people are always looking at the UK saying we've got to cut down our carbon emissions. Compared to the US, we're nothing. We have a much higher levels of public transport. Our transportation isn't so far. We fly less than in the US. It's a big country. They need to fly around. But he's used this dividing kind of paradigm. Why should we're America first? Who cares about the world? Which is completely nonsensical in the global context. And we need a leader like America to show the way. Interestingly, while there's been this vacuum caused by America's lack of world leadership, who's pumped up? China is now saying that they're going to be the greenest economy. So interesting, the highest polluting country has had a whole raft of policies which they can do because of the centrist economy. Nothing can stop them. And you will find that China actually, contrary to what we said earlier on, the US may innovate solar panels, but 90% of solar panels are actually made in China. And what's the US's addressing of all of this? And the America's been an interesting, by the way, because they have been free of all the Arabic countries, which is probably why they haven't gone to war, because of their fracking. So actually, it's become energy independent. And if they do develop all these green technology, it'll be more energy independent. So very interesting future. And I think Biden is actually, I was pretty anti-Biden at the beginning because I just thought he didn't look the right kind of guy. But actually, a lot of people voted for him because he wasn't Trump. And maybe he is the right guy because he's got a sort of conciliatory, avuncular approach. An older man we can all trust in and say he's got good judgment. And, Biden's personal story is really interesting because he's lost half of his family through tragedy. Mm-hmm. So that to me makes a nice person who's leading the country. I think he'll be great.
She seems to be a bit more connected.
Yeah, I think he's the complete opposite of Trump, and I think in some ways that might have helped him. And it's interesting that while Trump, as you were alluding to before, he goes America first or just us, or this kind of, he divides even America up into those who he supports and support him and those who don't. This idea of lock her up, she's the enemy of the state. And I think that it's interesting to see how different Biden is. Biden came out with a statement, we don't see red or blue, we see the American people. He wants to get back into the world. And I think it's very interesting for America, and this idea where at a global economy we are becoming more and more integrated, and globalization is happening at a faster pace than ever before. It seems kind of strange that Trump would want to come out of that completely, but it backs behind his ideology, us and them, us versus them, that drives him.
One of the interesting things is that it's about time. It takes time to get a vaccine. It takes time to distribute it. It takes time for the economy to recover. And then for that economy to recover, that's where the opportunity is, right? So to a certain extent, we've almost had our slates wiped clean with the stock markets all dropping as they are. And on this rise of optimism, the fact that, we've got a vaccine, possibly, it's got a 90% efficacy. But the issue is not about that. The issue is about, whether people build that confidence in their business. It will take time. My worry would be, and I'd be really interested in knowing each of your opinions on this, is that, you've got 4 years in government, right? If it takes time to get the vaccine out and it takes that, will people be impatient and go, well, we should have been with the other guy, because, he would have been a person who would have taken us in the right direction, and we wasted 4 years, and suddenly they start leaning to the right again. And if you look in history, sadly, after the last pandemic about 1918, there was a hockey stick, but it was also the result of the world wars, and that's a really worrying thing to look at. Gurpreet, do you think we're now in an era of risk, or do you think there could be a situation where people get even more protectionist because they're clamoring for the vaccine, they're clamoring survival, the economy dives even deeper because people have a lack of confidence to come back to work,
Well, it was interesting to see actually under Trump how companies supplying PPE had to make sure they were fulfilling US needs first. So it moved, that protectionism was there. It moved companies away from, say, supplying globally to supplying locally, and then their global trade becoming secondary. The issue around, I think we're still somewhat in the shadow of Trump. We're not out of that yet, but it's going to be interesting to see how far Joe Biden is able to start making changes to actually where he needs to look at supporting the American people also, because I don't think Trump supporters can be ignored although Trump was constantly saying "Make America Great Again," but how much benefit was that for the average Joe on the street in the US? For those of you who travel to the US, you'll be amazed by the stark differences. The poverty of people rough on the sleep. There is no safety net to catch people there, like we have in the UK. We have the amazing NHS. They don't have that there. So you start to see these stark differences. So in making America great again, who became great? Was it the American people? How much did they benefit from that? Or was it the American corporations? I think history will have to tell us that answer. But what Joe Biden, in my view, needs to do is start serving his people, make their lives better. Yes, the global and international stage is something which is important to us as people sitting outside the US. But when we look to Boris Johnson, I'm sure his foreign policy isn't the first thing we're looking at. We're looking at his domestic policy. And the same, I think, is something which Joe Biden needs to concentrate on insofar as that he's got a chance to own that space, to show Americans that he can make a difference for the people there.
Absolutely. So we've got a few minutes left. Let me give the last minute to either one of the actually to both the other guests. Gurpreet, really appreciate your time. I know you're really busy. You've got so many things that you're doing. So thanks for coming on the show and very great insights. Really appreciate it. Gia, do you want to give us say the last 60 seconds, and then I'll pass on to Preet to close. Are you optimistic for the future? Are you really, really optimistic that we got a different direction that we can all move in now and we can believe in? And I said, do you think we got enough time? Has he got enough time to do it?
Well, time is a different issue, but I can say that the election of Biden has really been a turning point, at least for many of the spectators like me watching. And I do think that this will be a time of change for America because Donald Trump, as I said before, he was divisive, and I think that allowed America, it facilitated America to continue that way. And I think Biden will help create and reform this culture to allow the future to be more progressive and more kind of culturally kind to one another. And that's why I do have hopes, and not even just Biden himself. I think Kamala Harris, her election as the first African American and first Indian American woman to be in power is something great. And I don't think America was ready for a female leader, but they might be ready for a female vice president, and I really hope that drives change. And like she says, I hope she isn't the last to come.
Yeah, absolutely, and about time as well. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, Gia. Really appreciate it. Dr. Preet, so are you optimistic this vaccine's going to put everyone in, kind of like, hey, we got a new cure, because everyone seems to be hyped up about it. There are many different trials going on around the world.
You didn't need that many brains to work out that in reaction to something like this, which is basically man-made, that we would find a man-made solution. The question is time and safety. But I'm really pleased to see that's happened. I'm also hopeful for the future of America because not every policy that Trump had was bad, in my opinion. There had to be some redressing of things like the role of China versus America, the role of democracy versus autocracy. And some of these things that Trump did, are not universally bad. The manner in which he did it and, his divisiveness has caused untold consternation in the country, and people have voted not for Biden, they voted anti-Trump because they don't want that nonsense. They want normalcy to be restored. So with normalcy, with the acceptance that you can't just pump up taxes so much, with the acceptance that there is a new world order, China has come to the front of the table, and you have to address some of those things and take some of the ideas that Trump had, but make it into something reasonable. I think I am optimistic, actually. I just hope that he can spend enough time not just dealing with policies, but dealing with healing, which means going around to all of those Bible Belt states, to the states where the Latinos haven't voted for him, and persuading them that actually, having a healthcare system or, having Obamacare is not such an evil thing. It's helpful. I've got relatives who came into America recently, and until they had Obamacare, they didn't actually have any health security. We can't have that kind of a system in the world's number one, economy. It's ridiculous. So I am hopeful that something good will come out, which is a mingling of these different things, and hopefully he will pay attention to all of his constituents of America and remove this, racial divisiveness and all the other things that we've had under Trump, which is just terrible, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. So I'd say thanks so much, Preet. Very much ending on a optimistic note. That we all pray that we are one world. It's a very easy thing to say, but when it comes down to people looking at their inside in their pockets, unfortunately the dollar votes or the pound votes. But I hope people in time will look beyond that, and hopefully we've got lots of words of hope there, in someone who can bring about that change and be inspirational. Not necessarily for the Americans, but also to lead the way in other areas as well, in terms of other countries, which is what really America has done in the past. I'm not saying that the only or the greatest. Everyone has got an account. They don't necessarily have the most the reputation that necessarily is to be seen by everyone to be the brilliant reputation that you need. There are many countries and issues that have risen from that. So we can only, as our individuals, look towards positivity and optimism, and to do the right thing, and not to be ruthless, and not to have bad manners, but to treat each other with respect. So on that note, we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much to the guests.